My name's Liam. I'm 33, married to Chloe for 6 years, and my mom, Carol, has been with her partner, Mick, for 4 years now. I want to tell you about the driveway last Saturday, but first I need to walk you through those 4 years. Because I think what happened outside Mick's car was never really about a jacket or a comment about visiting. It was the first time in 4 years that something underneath the surface of that house finally became visible to anyone standing outside it. There's a fifth thing, actually earlier than all the others, that I think I understood the significance of only in hindsight, once everything else had already clicked into place. About 3 months into my mom and Mick's relationship, before he'd even moved in properly, my mom mentioned to me, almost in passing over the phone, that Mick had once told her during an argument early on that her previous marriage to my dad must have failed at least partly because of things she'd done, some vague, unspecified failing on her part that he'd apparently felt entitled to speculate about after knowing her for only a matter of weeks. I remember being genuinely angry on my mom's behalf when she told me that, and saying so, and my mom laughing it off almost immediately, saying he hadn't meant it unkindly, that he'd just been trying to understand her better, that some men just weren't very good with words even when their intentions were fine. I accepted that explanation at the time, mostly because I wanted to, because the alternative, that a man she'd known for 3 months had already started rewriting the story of her first marriage to suit some need of his own, felt like too large and too early a red flag to sit with properly. This early in a relationship, I badly wanted to see her happy in. Mick moved in with my mom about 6 months after she started seeing him. Quicker than I'd have liked at the time, though. I told myself, the way I think a lot of adult children do about their parents' new relationships, that it wasn't really my place to have an opinion about the pace of it. My mom had been on her own for close to a decade by then, since my dad died, and I remember being genuinely glad, in that first year, to see her laughing again, going out for meals, seeming lighter than she had in a long time. I want to be honest that this made it harder, not easier, to notice what started happening underneath that lightness over the years that followed, because the story I wanted to believe, that Mick had simply made my mom happy again, was a much more comfortable story than the one I eventually had to admit was closer to the truth. I want to walk through what I actually noticed, in the order I noticed it, because I think the slowness of it is the part that's hardest to convey in the short version of this story, and because I think it's the part that explains why it took me 4 years to end up standing in that driveway instead of 6 months. The first thing I noticed was how Mick occupied a room. I don't have a cleaner way to describe it than that. He wasn't loud, not in the way you'd picture if I told you he had a temper. He had a specific, quiet way of positioning himself, physically and conversationally, so that whatever mood he happened to be carrying that day became the room's mood, without him ever needing to announce it. I remember a family dinner about a year into the relationship, an ordinary Sunday roast, where Mick came in from the garden in a foul mood about something to do with a neighbor's fence, and said almost nothing about it directly, just sat at the table with a specific heaviness to his silence. And I watched the entire conversation around that table quietly reorganize itself around not upsetting him further, my mom included, everyone's voices dropping a register. The usual teasing and crosstalk of a family dinner replaced with careful, neutral small talk until his mood eventually lifted on its own, an hour or so later, and the table's atmosphere lifted with it as though nothing had ever been different. The second thing I noticed, more slowly, over roughly the second year of the relationship, was how much smaller my mom got around him. I want to be precise about that word, smaller, because I don't mean physically. I mean something closer to how much space she let herself take up in her own opinions when he was in the house, compared to when he wasn't. I remember more than once having a conversation with her on the phone where she'd argue a point about something, politics, a family decision, some ordinary disagreement with her usual confidence, and then watching, on a later visit, the exact same topic come up with Mick in the room, and my mom agreeing with whatever he'd just said, sometimes the literal opposite of what she'd told me a few days earlier, with no acknowledgement at all that her position had changed, as though the version of herself she was on the phone with me simply didn't carry over into rooms Mick occupied. The third thing, which I think mattered more than either of the first two once I finally understood what I was looking at, happened about 2.5 years into the relationship at my mom's 60th birthday, a modest gathering at a restaurant she'd chosen herself, months in advance, somewhere she'd always wanted to go. Mick arrived slightly late, having apparently had an argument with a colleague on the phone in the car park beforehand, and spent most of the meal in the same quiet, heavy mood I'd first noticed at that Sunday roast, barely engaging with the toasts, checking his phone repeatedly at the table. I remember my mom, at her own birthday dinner, spending an uncomfortable amount of energy trying to draw him back into a better mood, complimenting things he said, laughing a little too readily at small jokes, in a way that struck me, watching it happen, as something closer to careful management of a volatile presence than an ordinary birthday dinner between two people who loved each other. The fourth thing, Closer to the driveway itself happened about 8 months ago, when I dropped by unannounced on a weekday afternoon to return a ladder I'd borrowed, and found Mick in the middle of what I can only describe as a controlled but unmistakable dressing down of my mom in the kitchen about something to do with how she'd loaded the dishwasher. Of all things, his voice flat and level the entire time, never raised but relentless, circling the same small point over and over in a way that made the actual content of the complaint feel almost beside the point, as though the dressing down itself, rather than the dishwasher, was the actual purpose of the exercise. My mum saw me in the doorway partway through it, and her face did something I've thought about often since, a kind of instant practice smoothing over, straightening up, saying brightly that I'd caught them mid-conversation about nothing important. And Mick, seeing me, switched tone just as quickly, becoming easy and jovial in a way that made the whole previous 2 minutes feel almost like something I might have imagined if I hadn't watched it with my own eyes. Didn't say anything to my mum about any of these 4 things at the time they happened, individually. I told myself each time some version of the same reasoning. It wasn't my place. It was probably just an ordinary, difficult patch. All couples have moods and disagreements, and I wasn't there enough, day to day, to really understand the full texture of their relationship the way she did. I understand now, looking back, that this reasoning was doing exactly the same work for me that my mum's own careful management of mixed moods was doing for her. A comfortable, deniable way of not looking directly at something that would have required an uncomfortable response if I had. Last Saturday, I went round to drop off some tools I'd borrowed a few weeks earlier. My 6-year-old son, Freddie, in the back seat, waiting to head off to a friend's birthday party straight afterward. Mick was outside washing his car when I pulled up, and when I mentioned, carrying the box up the driveway, that I couldn't stay long because Freddie had somewhere to be, Mick said something about how I'd always found excuses not to properly visit my own mother since he'd come along, delivered in that flat, needling tone I'd come to recognize over 4 years as his specific way of provoking a reaction without ever quite starting anything himself directly. I told him I visited plenty. I just didn't particularly enjoy standing around making small talk with him specifically, and I hadn't meant it to come out as sharp as it did, but I also wasn't going to pretend otherwise standing there in his driveway with my son waiting in the car. He put the sponge down slowly, walked toward me, close enough that I could smell the beer already on him at 11 in the morning, and said I'd always had an attitude problem since the day he'd tried being decent to me, and maybe it was time somebody finally corrected that. I told him to back up. He didn't. He kept closing the gap and grabbed the collar of my jacket with a wet hand, said something about respect, about this being his house now too, and how somebody should have taught me that a long time ago. I put my hand up flat against his chest and pushed him back hard enough that he stumbled against his own car, more surprised than hurt, and for a second, neither of us moved. My mum had come to the doorway by then. I want to describe exactly what I saw, because it's the detail I've turned over more than any other since. She was standing perfectly still, watching the whole thing unfold, and not a single word came out of her, not telling him to stop, not asking if I was okay, just watching, arms already crossed tight over her chest, the way I've come to recognize as the exact posture she uses when she's trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible in her own home. I looked at her for a second, waiting for something, anything, and she just held my gaze and then looked away first. Freddie was still in the car, close enough to have seen at least some of it through the windscreen, and that's the exact moment I stopped caring about de-escalating anything quietly for anyone else's comfort. I took out my phone and called the police right there in the driveway, gave the address, said my stepfather had just grabbed me, and I wasn't willing to let it slide because my 6-year-old son was sitting 20 feet away, watching his dad get manhandled by a grown man twice his size. Mick laughed, said I was being pathetic, dramatic, that grabbing a jacket wasn't assault. My mum still hadn't moved from that doorway, arms wrapped around herself now, looking at the ground instead of either of us. 2 officers arrived within about 10 minutes. A woman I'd guess was in her late 30s who introduced herself as PC Adeyemi, and a younger constable who mostly took notes while she led the conversation. She took statements separately, mine first in the driveway, quietly and methodically asking me to walk through exactly what had happened, in what order, without any leading questions, and Mick's afterward, closer to his car, out of earshot of where I was standing with Freddie, who I'd by then brought out of the car and was holding against my hip, partly for comfort and partly, I think, because some part of me wanted him physically close while all of this settled. Mick's tone changed completely the second the officers showed up. All reasonable explanations and misunderstandings, a slightly wounded, bewildered version of himself that I recognized, watching it from a distance, as a performance I'd never once seen him give for anyone but strangers with a uniform on. PC Adeyemi came back to speak to me afterward and told me plainly that based on both accounts and the visible marks on my jacket collar, they'd be issuing Mick with a formal warning for common assault, that it would be logged on record, and that if anything similar happened again, The existing report would give any future incident considerably more weight. She asked me carefully whether I wanted to pursue anything further than the warning, and I told her honestly that in the moment, I mostly wanted it documented and wanted my mom checked on, more than I wanted to escalate things toward a prosecution that I suspected. In a case like this one, with no prior police history and a version of events that could be framed as an isolated shove, was unlikely to go much further regardless of what I chose to pursue. They gave him the warning, noted everything down carefully, and PCIDME then walked over to the doorstep where my mom was still standing, and asked her directly, gently, whether she was okay, whether there was anything she wanted to tell them separately, away from either me or Mick. My mom said yes, quickly, too quickly, still not looking up from the ground, and PCIDME, to her credit, didn't simply accept that at face value. She asked a second, more specific question, whether my mom felt safe in that house generally, and I watched my mom's hands tighten slightly around her own arms before she said, again, that everything was fine, that this had just been an unfortunate misunderstanding between her son and her partner that had gotten out of hand. PCIDME handed her a small card before she left, which I noticed my mom slip into her cardigan pocket without looking at it, and I understood, watching that whole exchange, that whatever information was on that card, a helpline number, a reference number, something along those lines, my mom had no intention of ever looking at it again once the officers had driven away. I left without going inside. I want to tell you what happened in the days since, because I think what came after that driveway has been, in its own quiet way, more difficult to sit with than the confrontation itself. My mom texted me that same night, saying I'd embarrassed Mick in front of the neighbors and made things tense at home for no reason. I told her I hadn't made anything tense. He had. And I was done pretending her doorstep silence hadn't told me everything I needed to know about how things actually are in that house when nobody else is watching. She didn't reply to that message. I told Chloe the whole thing that same evening, sitting at our kitchen table once Freddie was in bed, and she listened without interrupting until I'd finished. And then she asked me gently how long I thought this had actually been going on, the pattern underneath the driveway rather than the driveway itself. I told her about the 5 things I'd noticed over 4 years, laid out properly for the first time to anyone, and she said something that stayed with me since, that she'd noticed her own smaller version of the same thing. More than once, on family occasions, my mom's voice going quieter, her opinions softening in real time depending on whether Mick was in the room, and that she'd never said anything to me directly because she hadn't wanted to seem like she was criticizing my mom's relationship, the exact same reasoning, in a slightly different shape, that I'd been using on myself for 4 years. Chloe told me something else, too, that night that I hadn't known before. She said that at our own wedding 6 years ago, she'd overheard Mick saying something to one of his own friends during the reception, a comment about how my mom had finally landed on her feet with him after my dad, delivered with a specific proprietary satisfaction that Chloe had found unsettling enough to remember clearly 6 years later, though she'd never mentioned it to me at the time because it had seemed, in the moment, like an odd but ultimately harmless thing for a man to say at a wedding. The kind of comment you file away rather than act on. Hearing that now alongside everything else, I understood it as one more early data point neither of us had thought worth raising with the other until a driveway confrontation gave us both permission to finally compare notes. My younger sister, Bex, who lives about 2 hours away and sees my mom considerably less often than I do, called me the day after Chloe and I talked. Having heard a fragmented version of events from our mom herself, framed predictably as me having overreacted to an argument, I told Bex the actual sequence of events in full, and she went quiet for a long moment before telling me something I hadn't expected, that she'd always found Mick's house exhausting to be in, her word, without ever quite being able to explain why to herself. Some quality to visiting there that left her feeling like she'd been holding her breath for the entire duration of the visit, and that she'd generally started finding reasons to visit less often over the past couple of years without ever consciously deciding that's what she was doing. Hearing my sister describe, independently and in her own words, a version of the same low-grade vigilance I'd been feeling myself for years, made the whole pattern feel considerably less like something I might have been imagining or overreacting to, and considerably more like something the entire family had been quietly, separately adjusting around without any of us ever once naming it out loud to each other. I called my Auntie Jean, my mom's older sister, a few days later, mostly to ask, carefully, whether she'd noticed anything over the years that I hadn't. Jean was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then she told me she'd had her own concerns for a while, that she'd raised it once, gently, with my mom about 18 months ago over a coffee, asking directly whether everything was all right with Mick. And my mom had brushed it off entirely, told her she was imagining things, that Mick could be moody but he'd never once raised a hand to her, which Jean had taken at the time. More or less at face value because what else, she said, could she really do with an answer like that, delivered firmly, by a grown woman entitled to make her own decisions about her own relationship? I understood hearing that John and I had both been doing our own separate versions of the same careful non-intervention for years, neither of us ever comparing notes with the other until a driveway confrontation forced the whole thing into the open at once. Freddie asked me about it the next morning. In the direct, uncomplicated way 6-year-olds ask enormous questions over breakfast. He said he'd seen Grandma's boyfriend being cross with me and asked if I was in trouble. I told him no, that sometimes grown-ups don't behave the way they're supposed to, and that Daddy had done the right thing by not letting it carry on, and that if anyone ever grabbed him like that, he should tell me or Mummy straight away, no matter who it was. He nodded, seemingly satisfied with that, and asked if we could still make it to the party on time, which we did with about 10 minutes to spare. Freddie apparently already having filed the whole morning away somewhere less significant than I had. I think about my mum's silence on that doorstep more than almost anything else from that morning, more even than Mick's hand on my collar. I think about how total it was, how practiced it looked, the specific stillness of someone who has learned over years exactly how to make herself disappear from a moment rather than intervene in it. I understand now that I wasn't actually watching my mum fail to defend me in that one instance. I was watching for the first time with my own eyes rather than through secondhand fragments and half-noticed dinner table moods. The actual daily texture of what her 4 years with Mick have apparently required of her, the specific constant labor of managing his moods and shrinking her own opinions, and now, it turns out, standing silently by while he put his hands on her own son. Because some deeply worn groove in her had already decided, long before that Saturday, that intervening carried more risk than staying still. I don't know what happens next with my mum, or with Mick, or with the 4 of us as a family going forward. I know I'm not willing to bring Freddie back to that house until something changes in a way I can actually see and trust, not simply hear about secondhand. I know my mum hasn't called since that unanswered text, and I know I'm not going to be the one who reaches out first this time. Not because I want to punish her, but because I think, for the first time in 4 years, I need her to be the one who decides whether she's ready to look directly at what her own silence on that doorstep actually told me, rather than me quietly managing around it the way I've been managing around every uncomfortable thing about Mick since the day he moved in. I've thought a great deal, in the days since, about that small card PC Adeyemi handed my mum, the one she slipped into her cardigan pocket without looking at. And I keep wondering whether it's still sitting in that same pocket, unread, or whether it's already been thrown away, or whether in some version of events I genuinely like to believe in, but don't yet have any evidence for. She's actually looked at it properly, alone, at some point when neither Mick nor I nor anyone else in the family was watching. I don't know the answer, and I understand now that not knowing is probably going to be a permanent feature of whatever relationship I have with my mum from here on, at least for a while. A constant low-grade uncertainty about how much of what happens in that house I'll ever actually be told, versus how much will continue to be managed, smoothed over, and quietly kept from the rest of us the way it apparently has been for 4 years already. I think about my sister's word, exhausting more than I expected to when she first said it. I think about how many family gatherings I've sat through over the past 4 years without ever once naming that same feeling myself, telling myself instead that Mick was simply an acquired taste, a bit intense, not really my cup of tea, softer words for something that Bex, without ever comparing notes with me, had independently landed on a more honest description for. I think about how much easier it would have been, in some ways, if any of us, me, Bex, Jean, Chloe, had simply said the harder word to each other years earlier, rather than each of us quietly managing our own private discomfort and isolation, visiting less, staying watchful, saying nothing, until a driveway confrontation with my own son in the backseat of the car finally forced the whole scattered picture into a single frame. I think, too, about what it actually means to be the person who finally makes the call that changes the shape of a family's careful, unspoken arrangement. Because I understand now that this is exactly what I did, whether or not that was fully my intention standing in that driveway with Mick's hand on my collar. 4 years of an entire extended family independently managing around Mick's moods. My mum's shrinking, the exhausting quality of that house. All of it held in place by an unspoken agreement that none of us, individually, wanted to be the one who disturbed it. I disturbed it. Not deliberately, not as some carefully planned intervention, just because my son was in the car and I ran out of patience, in that exact moment, for managing anything quietly for anyone else's comfort. I don't regret that I did it. I do think about what it means that it took exactly that specific combination of circumstances, my own child as a witness, to finally push me past 4 years of careful, deniable non-intervention that everyone else in the family had also, in their own separate ways, been quietly practicing. I keep thinking about the specific moment she looked away first. Not Mick laughing it off to the officers, not the warning they gave him that will likely mean nothing the next time his mood turns heavy in that kitchen. Her, standing in a doorway, arms wrapped around herself, choosing, in the space of about 1 second, to break eye contact with her own son rather than to say a single word on his behalf. I think that's the image I'll carry longest out of that whole morning, longer even than the beer on his breath or his hand on my collar, because I think it's the one that finally answered a question I'd been quietly, carefully avoiding asking myself for 4 straight years, not whether Mick had a problem, which I'd suspected for a long time without fully admitting it, but whether my mom, faced with a clear and undeniable choice, would actually choose her son over her own carefully maintained peace. I know the answer now. I wish I didn't, but I do, and I don't think either of us can quietly pretend otherwise the next time one of us picks up the phone. I don't know what I'll say to her when that call eventually happens, whenever it happens, whichever one of us finally makes it. I know I won't be shouting, the same way I wasn't really shouting in that driveway, even at the loudest point of the whole thing. I think what I actually want to say to her, when the time comes, is something closer to what I told her in that text she never replied to, that I didn't make anything tense in that house, he did, and that 4 years of her silence had already told me everything I needed to know about how things actually work there, long before I ever had to watch it happen with my own eyes, in front of my own son, on an ordinary Saturday morning that was only ever supposed to be about returning a box of borrowed tools.